Let's see. No, I'm not going to share my screen. Hold on. First, I'm going to get this set up from the beginning. Pop it up. There we go. All right. Welcome again. All right. Share screen. All right. Did that work for you all?
Yes. Yes, we see it.
Okay. Well, you guys all turned into like a strip of people. Like it went like, that's very strange. Okay. Well, oh, here we go. All right. Oh, and I like Hillary still. Oh, I was gonna say I like Hillary still Fox. All right. So welcome to the Children's System Advisory Council, our June edition. I'm Chelsea Holcomb. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the Director of Child and Family Behavioral Health and your host for today. I was saying as people were joining, I created a lofty agenda for our 2.5 hours together. But what's most important is we have time and connection. So if we decide to take longer in any of these areas, we can, especially the data that we have for you today on the emergency department utilization and boarding, we can do that at another time. We also have public community conversations that were scheduled. So we could also do it there. But we just get excited to talk to you about things. And so there we are. I'm going to move the chat over here so I can see it in case you all are chatting with me. So in the chat, if you don't mind doing introductions in the chat so that folks know who's here and your role on CSAC if you're a member, or a title or interest if you're not a member. And that way people know who's here. And then I thought the other thing that it would be nice to hear from folks is, you know, are there any announcements? We were just talking about the legislative session, any bills you want this group to have awareness of, you know, just feel free to put that in the chat as well. And then the other announcement, I just would welcome, in our team meetings, we usually have kind of not an icebreaker, but just like something to start off and connect on that isn't business, work. And so the question I guess I would put out to you is something that you had done or something that had happened with you or that you've heard about that inspired hope within you. And so being able to share that in the chat or even throughout the meeting, if you raise your hand and talk of sharing hope, it's important for us to know that we can learn hope, we can teach hope, and that it's contagious. So we're going to do announcements and introductions in the chat, talk about hope. We're going to go over the roadmap. Oh, Roxanne, go ahead.
Sorry, I just wanted to share that something I found, I realized last month in the CSAC meeting is that there has been a lot more effort in the collaboration between OHA and ODE, and that really has impacted my hope for these youth and families enormously.
That's great. Thank you for sharing that. We're going to talk about our child and family behavioral health roadmap and the planning that we want to do with you, but mostly just get you all up to speed of what is, so that we can talk about CSAC's role. We have an ask that I talked about last month of request for volunteers to have some meetings about CSAC and the redesign. We'll talk a little bit about that, and we'll show you how we're going to track the March and May recommendations. look at some emergency department data if we have time, and then we'll have some legislative session updates, but it's not over. So, all right. And then there's some pretty slides because, you know, it's fun. All right, so I'm going to do this pretty quick because I think some of you have heard this before, but certainly feel free to ask questions or slow me down if you're like, wait, what is going on? What are you talking about? And then we also, if somebody on my team can put the link to the roadmap page on our website, it has a lot more detailed information about what I'm going to talk about. So just a brief history. In 2020, the Secretary of State finished up an audit of children's behavioral health, and it actually got much broader than children's behavioral health. It started off in the children's, but then got much broader, and that's linked on the webpage. And it included quite a few recommendations, and not all were directly impacted on the children's system, but quite a few were. And we had been involved in that audit for, I think, 18 months at that point, before it was actually published in 2020. And so when COVID hit and we all went digital, the Child and Family Behavioral Health team took the opportunity to take everything that we had all heard through our different roles, our programs, through CSAC, through through our other advisory councils like the Alliance, and put forth a policy vision paper. And we published that in fall of 2020. And we used that policy vision paper to do community engagement. And we worked with CSAC on getting feedback and basically tried to build out where are we now and where are we heading with children's behavioral health and do some prioritization. We had a family policy subgroup of CSAC that also did some work on that and published a paper, which is also on the website. And we did some think tanks and work with Youth Era as well to do some young adult engagement. So it was not perfect by any means. And we had lots of feedback even from this group that people wish they had been involved in the writing of the policy vision paper. It felt too final the way it was drafted, that we didn't do enough engagement with communities of color or other vulnerable populations. There was a lot of sort of feedback and focus on that policy vision paper. And ultimately the roadmap, the plan that we have. So knowing that this was clunky, it wasn't perfect, it was really to get something. And now we're at a place where we have something, we're tracking the work that we're doing, we're tracking the priorities, but we're also at a place where we're really going to ramp up this next year to sort of revision, and not revision it, but redo it, right? Like get it updated for another 4 years. So we're going to talk about sort of what is and the scaffolding of the plan today, just so that everybody's up to speed of where we are, and that you know it's there so you can see the progress of our projects, but also the invitation to walk with us to update it for 24-28. So this is the beautiful graphic that Hillary I just have to give her credit every time I look at it, because it took many months to sort of get a picture right, to kind of put it all together, which is hard to do with graphics. But what this shows is really how all of the work that we're doing in children's behavioral health is connected to the system of care vision. So the System of Care Advisory Council's vision. It's connected obviously to OHA's vision for a healthy Oregon and to eliminate health inequities. And then the mission of our unit. All that is sort of where we're trying to head with the work that we're doing. And the framework of the roadmap that we worked on through the process I just talked about was the 3 pillars that you see below here at the bottom of health equity, youth and family voice, and trauma-informed principles really being the anchor of all the work that we're doing. And it doesn't mean we've got that perfect by any means of any of those pillars, but we're trying to view all the work that we do, all the new work we do, all the existing work we do through those pillars to make sure that we're either aligning, realigning, or discontinuing, right? If it doesn't match those in the how and what we're doing. So those are our pillars, and I define them on the next slide. And then the strategic pathways, right, is how we're organizing our work. And we'll go into that a little bit more. So I have this out of order. I'm going to go here first. So our strategic pillars. So again, these definitions have been through all of that community engagement and the feedback we received and consultation we did with the Uprise Collective that this group also worked with. These are how we're defining the strategic pillars. Through this next year, these are probably subject to be aligned with our new OHA leadership and our new governor. So we know that some of the language here will change, but not the core content of what we're trying to do. I'll go back one. Oops. There we go. So again, how we're organizing our work. So in the policy vision paper, we shifted it some through the feedback we received and just the immense amount of work that we think we can do. We organize it into working on the continuum of care for children's behavioral health, which is probably the largest. It's the largest part of the plan. And probably the largest part of our responsibility in the positions we hold at the state of Oregon, right? We're responsible for doing non-Medicaid and Medicaid programming and services and policy for children's behavioral health. So a lot of the work and strategies, and certainly a lot of the feedback that you all have given us is about the continuum of services. The other section of the roadmap is around youth and family engagement. And again, I think we've ebbed and flowed. We've grown a lot as a unit over the last 6 years. And so we're all doing this in very different ways throughout the unit and in our organization as a whole. And one thing we've learned is that while we have this work in our unit, children's behavioral health is bigger in OHA than just our unit. And we want to make sure that as others are doing youth and family engagement, that we're receiving that feedback to inform policy and program. So a lot of work to do here. And I think as Hillary and I were talking yesterday, this isn't just engagement of like, just getting feedback. Like we really need to start working on how do we center and be being driven by youth and families. And that's the shift that, you know, we're going to need your help and everybody's help to go from just saying like, hey, we wrote a paper, what do you think? To, okay, we need you to walk with us to make the system better. So the data section is really important. And it's really where we've spent a lot of focus this last year on, because we didn't have a lot of data, but now we do have data, but how do we use it? How do we framework it? How do we set goals around it? And we collected a lot of that national and statewide data, and that report, I think I'm looking at Hillary, that's on the roadmap webpage as well. So we just collected sort of a report of all the data that we are looking at on the website, and we're hoping to narrow those data points down to system indicators, right? So that we could be sharing with you and have a dashboard around the children's system dashboard or data points that we're paying attention to. And not that we wouldn't pay attention to all of it, but have those key ones so that we're all making decisions of where we're trying to get and monitoring if the things we're doing are making a difference. And that's qualitative and quantitative. And then this cross-system work. Obviously, everything we do is interconnected, like Roxanne said, with Oregon Department of Education and child welfare, the juvenile legal system. Like everything we do impacts all of those systems and vice versa. So that work is very important. And CSAC is named in the report or in our roadmap, and you know how we determine to walk together in this next year or so, I think is really important as it relates to the roadmap. So I talked a little bit about our engagement. Again, the feedback was that it was too little, too late. We didn't even do a great job internally. I still, when our newsletter comes out, I'll get people internal to OHA saying like, gosh, we had no idea you were doing any of this work, or we didn't know you had a roadmap. So we have and had a lot of work to do to get better at, and we continue to take the feedback we receive of how to communicate better, how to loop back. And obviously it's a big part of the roadmap actually is to do that better. That's actually a strategic goal. COVID obviously had impact on how this all came together. And obviously for future, this group, we've all talked about of getting more diversity of the feedback that we're receiving and focusing our work and then engaging more consistently. And I had to do a hashtag. I apologize. I don't think Jesse's here, but the loop back is so important. So like if Carol Dickey's giving us tons of feedback or the parent policy group is giving us feedback, we have to come back, right? We have to come back and say, this is what we heard. Is that correct? This is what we heard. And this is what we did with that information. Is that meeting the need? So that flow, and that looks different for an advisory group versus somebody who comes to our Time for Families. It looks different for different groups, but that's definitely a focus of us sort of getting better. That's a duplicate slide. So our ultimate goal, right, is to build a beautiful, responsive, equitable behavioral health continuum of care for children. This is how it's currently organized, and the sort of segments around this was taken from the evolution of system of care document, also on our webpage. Just thinking of like, what is best practice? What is sort of national best practice of what a continuum should include? And we sort of took this and got more specific with it to try to look at, what do we have in Oregon? What do we not have in Oregon? And what is not all the way implemented? Great example of mobile response and stabilization, right? We have the scaffolding, we have the funding, but it's not up and running across the state yet. And so we linked this also on our website so that we could be more specific, because the full picture is not ADA. It's not big enough. I mean, it's not big enough to be ADA compliant, and it doesn't work on a slide deck, but you can go, I think Hillary put it in the chat, you can go to the full picture and then link to our website of where we describe the services and link to what we do have in Oregon, again, knowing that it's not fully complete. So what are we doing? Okay, so the roadmap is huge. It's big. We've updated it once already with progress. I think our second progress is going to come out soon, and then we'll probably be updating it twice a year with progress toward our goals and projects. The continuum of care, again, we've been focusing on adequately resourcing it. As we were getting together, I was saying to Annette that a lot of I'm a bit spoiled. I've gone through 2 long sessions before this one and got everything I asked for. And this long session, I did not me, but we did not get what we had asked for. So the work that you all did of giving us feedback on our policy option packages, it's not looking good for us to get those things funded. So that will continue to be our focus, right? Is we have to at least get the funding and the scaffolding and the support, but there's a lot in the work that we can, even if we don't get those new investments, there's a lot we need to do of the current continuum that we have. And then obviously we also have sections on quality, right? We need, even if we have access to services, we want to make sure that that workforce is competent and confident to be able to support children and families. Go ahead, Annette.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt, but I've just been really confused by why they didn't put any funding into the suicide piece. And I just wonder if you have any context or insight into like what the slicing and dicing was that children's services and suicide stuff got cut out.
I have no idea. I wish I had more insight. I really do. I just don't know. And we're being, we're collaborating or collecting the information of the impact of that, like of the sort of what got left out, of what didn't get funded, so that DAS and LFO and the legislature and the governor's office understand the impact of that. But I don't have insight. I'm trying not to take it personally.
Yeah, me too.
Youth and family, but we should keep talking about that, because again, this group has opportunity, right? As we do these asks, as we go toward the legislature, it's helpful, councils and other family members and other people sort of walking with, if we're in alignment of what we're asking for, it's helpful in the future for us to do this work together. So youth and family engagement, I talked a little bit about that, and you all have met Nakobe. We're trying to really work with the new units and across the organization to get really figure out who is talking to who, what type of engagement opportunities are happening, and making sure that the feedback that is coming in, that we're getting it, and that the feedback we're receiving, that we're sharing it. So we're working on that. And again, trying to move through those of you who are familiar with the Heart's Ladder of engagement, right? We need to get beyond the sort of tokenism of like, we talk to parents and therefore we're going to do this. We have to really start figuring out with you all and others of how to walk with. And that will look different for a lot of different things that we're doing, but we still have a lot of work to do there. And then again, we're trying to be outward facing with anything we're doing so that you all have access to it, that you're able to share it, that you're able to take it back to your communities or your jobs or your, schools, and make sure that, you're doing your representation on the council, and that you can bring that feedback back to us. And not feedback. See, Hillary, I just keep saying feedback, and I don't mean that. So you can tell us what's up and tell us what to do. How about that? Data-driven decision, we've already talked about that. Again, we've been really focused on data so that we can rely both on qualitative and quantitative to drive the work we're doing and be able to give accurate pictures to you all and the community of what is happening across the state. Cross-system collaboration, super, super important. And I don't know, the slide got funky on the bottom. Sorry about that. The other piece is thinking about you all and the Alliance to Prevent Suicide, System of Care Advisory Council. We hear from the Oregon Council for Behavioral Health, the Alliance of Children's Providers, obviously our system partners. And then the Youth Suicide Intervention Prevention Plan is cross-system in its nature as well. And that plan obviously is linked to ours. I think here it's just, and I don't know if we've talked about this here at CSAC, but in the System of Care Advisory Council, there's a state agency standing committee. We call it the SAS group, or SASE, but it has all the child serving state agencies and OFSN Youth Era, and it's a subcommittee of the larger System of Care Advisory Council to look at the barriers that are coming up through the local systems of care to the statewide system of care. And we've been having a focused conversation on interrupting the birth to prison pipeline. And our unit really has dove into this concept as a way for us to look at our continuum, to look at our policies, to look at exclusionary criteria and other pieces to make sure that we're learning where we're contributing, but where we're interrupting. And being able to act as early as possible, but also looking at areas where we can make impact. A lot of times this concept is focused on the education system, which is very important, but behavioral health also contributes. And so it's been really awesome to walk with and talk to the other state agencies to really identify this. And then ultimately in this next year, thinking about that as we look at our work and what we're prioritizing and what we're doing. So this is a beautiful dashboard. I don't know if Sam's here today, but Sam Haskins on our team has been doing all the smart sheet magic and deserves all the credit for organizing and herding all of us cats to get this operational. And this gives you an idea of sort of where we were at the end of 2022 with our projects that are on the roadmap, and then the timeline of how we've sort of chunked out some of the projects on there. And I think because we're not getting new investments, we'll probably be able to take on more earlier, and that's on the 2023-2024 roadmap because we won't be implementing new things. So where are we at now? So Hillary reinitiated our parent policy group. And so they have had one meeting, they have another meeting coming up next month. And if you are a parent caregiver or no parent caregivers that would like to be, oh, look at that. See, Hillary's ahead of me in my presentation. So in the chat, you can send people to Hillary or go to her yourself and be a part of that group. You can read the report that the last group did. And the idea there is, again, learning how to move past getting feedback and actually have a diverse parent group walk with us to make sure the next iteration of this plan is meaningful. We have just launched yesterday a cross-division steering group. So within OHA, we have multiple divisions, and we're trying to really get involvement and buy-in across the whole agency so that this is not a unit plan. This is an OHA plan. There is a lot of work that happens and impacts children's behavioral health, as I talked about earlier, and we want to make sure that the plan is representative of all that OHA is doing. For example, like in March, when we were receiving some of the feedback from the Black community, there's a lot of work that is happening in OHA that actually directly impacts some of the recommendations we were hearing. It just doesn't live in our unit. So it's important that we start really showing up and representing all of what OHA is doing, not just what we're funding or overseeing in our unit. And that group will help us figure out our communications and engagement plan and coordination and all the things, hopefully. They were really into it, so it was very exciting. And then, of course, we have our advisory groups that we will rely on and partner with as we walk through the next year and years, really, of making sure that we continue to align our work. So I'm going to stop there. I'm going to stop sharing for a second so I can see humans. So that was a lot of information, and there's a lot of links in the chat, but I want to make sure we open it up if there are any questions or initial responses. We don't have to plan anything out today, but we wanted to make sure we anchored everybody with where we were. All right, well, go ahead, Carol. Thank you.
I'll give an initial response. Wow, exclamation point. This is extraordinary, Chelsea. So huge gratitude to you and to the entire group. I appreciate so much your humility, your openness in this process. And this is amazing. So today, this is what gives me hope. So just thank you so much.
Thank you, Carol. Well, you were a huge driver of making this happen. So I want to make sure that you also know that you, in your role in CSAC, but just your role of walking with me through a lot of this, helped make this happen. So I appreciate you. Well, just know that we're going to mess this up, right? We're going to do it. It's going to be bumpy. We're going to put out things and you're going to be like, what were you thinking? Or why did you prioritize that? Or, all the things. And we're ready for it. We want you to say that but we really want you to participate in any way you feel comfortable and have the bandwidth to do to keep us focused and grounded in the work that we're doing, and challenge all of us to walk outside of our comfort zone to talk to people that aren't normally here in these spaces, to make sure that they're included in the work moving forward. So I'll stop there. You have plenty of reading material if you're curious, which I know you are now. See, I gave you all the teasers. Be like, what is that report with all the data? All right, I'm going to stop talking and hopefully hand it over to Tam. And I don't know who else, unless you want me to set the stage for this. Are you ready?
I could, I'm not sure. I'm sorry, I started talking too soon. I have the recommendations tracker draft idea, if we're ready to do that.
All right, do you want me to set the stage for it?
Yes, please.
Okay, so in March and May, we had conversations around, feedback we received from the group that Nakobe invited to CSAC to present to you all. And we collected that, we sent it back out to you all in May and had additional conversations with you all in May in smaller groups where there was discussion about those recommendations and additional recommendations made. We've taken all of that and categorized it into a different document, so outside the roadmap. And then what we've done is, because my team is amazing, oh my gosh. So they took all of that, they organized it. And then what we've created is a smart sheet that CSAC, we can work with you. And we've linked to the road. Anyway, why don't you share screen and you can show it, and then you describe it, because it's amazing. It's going to help us stay accountable is what it's going to do together.
Are you seeing a smart sheet?
Yes.
Excellent. So this is a draft idea for tracking the recommendations from March and May. It's not complete by any means, because I didn't want to get too far into it without knowing if it would work for the group, or how different pieces would work. So it has just enough completed for you to be able to see how it could work. So these blue highlighted areas are the loose buckets that I fit the recommendations into to the best of my ability. And if I expand one, you can see the smaller items in that bucket. The next column is how the roadmap may connect to an item. So there's a link to the roadmap, and then a roadmap code to show you which line item to look at on the roadmap. And so those are included when the roadmap has something to say about that thing, a goal identified around that thing. The next column is current work, where I've got some links to, again, relevant current work being done in that area. The next column is child and family behavioral health staff who may be involved in that work somehow. And the next column is notes from staff about current work being done in that area. You can see that for the one showing right now, under the access bucket, ensure culturally specific suicide prevention, Jill and Shanda shared a lot of notes with me about current work being done in that area. And then next, I made a column for CSAC notes and to-do items, so we could use this as a functional tracker. Let's see. Maybe I'll show you a couple more buckets so you can see a little bit more about how far we've gotten on it. Continuous improvement is another bucket. Clarify roles and scope of OHA and CSAC is a specific recommendation that we heard from the March and May meetings. And so an example of the current work being done there would be the reimagining work group that we'll be talking about, associated staff. And I think, is that enough to see the idea here? Do we have any thoughts or suggestions, or maybe this tool wouldn't be useful for this group? What do you think?
Well, I've been taking up too much space in this meeting, though. Just one more thing to say. I think it's really good. And my only thing is I really struggle with smart sheets.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder if at some point, if we do end up really using this as a tool, do like a little mini session with all of us around doing the smart sheets, because it's just, yeah, this looks really, really like help us to be concrete about what's happening.
We do have a smart sheet genius on our team. I'm sure Sam would be happy to lend her expertise. And we don't have to go with smart sheet either. I'm sure we can find another way to approach this if smart sheet is going to be too difficult to work with. But we do have support options if you decide to use it.
I think ultimately what we were talking about too is that this could be our sort of tracker for this year, knowing that we are updating the roadmap. And so anything through here that doesn't feel resolved or needs to continue to be prioritized, we can move it into the roadmap if it's appropriate. Any other pieces of feedback on again, the only other thing I guess as I'm looking at it is also maybe whether we take the child and family behavioral health staff, just the unit qualifier and just have OHA staff and OHA staff notes. Because I think, again, what we found is a lot of the work is happening outside, which is exciting, right? A lot of this work isn't just happening in our unit, especially around the culturally specific community engagement and a lot of the work that public health is doing on the state health improvement plan and some of the other folks that were here in March. And so I really want to welcome them in to CSAC and this work, because there's just so much more work going on than we're even aware of, and want you all to know about it. Any other pieces of feedback on the tracking?
Can I just say welcome to so many OHA staff who have shown up, who are part of that community, who were here in March and are in the room today, and how seriously we've taken this feedback.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. All right, well, we will keep filling that out then and make some tweaks. And I think our commitment to you all is to be able to bring that to each meeting, if nothing else, for you to see the work that's being done, and or to bring back and say, we still don't understand this, or we just don't think this is our scope, and we've handed it off to X, Y, and Z. So again, that loop back, right? So that we're constantly making sure that you all know. And also, if there's things where you're like, well, yeah, you say you're doing that, and I went to the link, but that isn't what I heard, or that isn't enough, or that needs to be prioritized. Like, I think those are some of the conversations that we can have as it relates to that. All right, thank you. All right, our next thing. So CSAC, the Children's System Advisory Council, has been around a long time. For a period of time, it was in statute as it related to the wraparound initiative in Oregon and implementing wraparound statewide. With the passage of Senate Bill 1 in 2019, CSAC was removed from statute, and not because no one did anything wrong, just the wraparound was rolled out. So that statute the language was antiquated, and you all were not rolling out wraparound at that point. And so Senate Bill 1 removed that statute language. We have bylaws, and as you know, but we're not following the bylaws, I guess, is what I want to bring to this group's attention. Typically, this group is run by an executive group that is a parent or a young adult and a provider. And there is, I think it's 4 seats that are sort of the executive group that we support from an administrative perspective to run CSAC. So typically OHA isn't running this meeting. It's been run by parents and youth and young adults and other providers or other system partners. And for a weird like convening of events, I think it was probably about 1.5 years ago. I'm kind of looking at Carol, but like at one point, our whole exec team, either their term limit was up or they were moving on because of bandwidth or whatever reason. But all of a sudden we had no executive group to run CSAC. And so our staff have stepped in at different times to facilitate and keep the meetings moving, and obviously keeping our conversations going. But at this point, we really need to kind of turn back to you all, because councils are, they take a lot of work, and it's really your work, and we want to support you if we want to keep the model that's currently in bylaw. And so the ask right now, we don't need to fix this right now, but the ask is if there are any of you in CSAC, and even if you're not a member of CSAC, but you have interest in this council development, is to do a 4-meeting work group to have some discussion with, people in OHA present to support the conversation of what do we want to do with CSAC? Do we want to keep the bylaws as they are and try to get an executive committee in place and start moving the way we have in the past with applications and the seats filled and tracking term limits and all the things? And I think Tamara sent out the bylaws to you, so that should be as part of the invite. So you guys should have them. or do we want to redesign it? Do we want to rebrand it? I think the other feedback we've heard is it gets confused with the System of Care Advisory Council because the names are so close. And this group was kind of the original group owning those values and principles. Not that we don't own them now, but this is really a group that is advising on children's behavioral health and not necessarily the whole system. And so we have an opportunity, I guess. And I think we have need, as you saw through the roadmap and through our values, to do this engagement and walking with. So we have needs in children's behavioral health to walk with you for system change, but we also want this group to be meaningful and led by you, and not by us. Or if you want it led by us, we want it to be intentional and not just because of a series of events or COVID fatigue or all the things. So if you are interested in having, again, smaller conversations outside of CSAC to bring some ideas back to the larger group, we're inviting that now. And so you can message Tamara directly and just let her know, say, yes, I would love to spend my summer and fall revisioning, what a council could look like for children's behavioral health. Because you can start from scratch if you want, right? And we can bring it back to this larger group and have some larger conversations about it. Any questions about that ask? And if we get no takers,
Thank you.
Oh, go ahead, Roxanne.
I just wanted to say thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. And I just say, like, if there's no one, if we hear from no one, we're going to take that as an invitation for us to do some revisioning and redesigning and give some ideas back to this group. Does that feel fair? Okay. All right, how am I doing on time, Tamara? Does Hillary have time to dive into her presentation?
I say yes. We got a little turned around on the agenda, so we're good on
That would
time.
be my fault, I'm sure.
It was a lot of agenda to follow. It's great.
I know, I'm so sorry. Well, does everyone want to take just like a 5-minute deep breath, get a glass of water? We're going to dive into data. So everyone has different, visceral response to that. Like some people get really excited, like, give me numbers. And some people are like, oh, I need like a snack and a beverage. So why don't you raise your virtual hand if you would like to take a 5-minute break before we dive into the data. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay, that's enough. That's great. Let's take a 5 minutes. Did you see how scientific that was? So let's take a 5-minute beverage snack break and bring our best selves back for Hillary to tell us what's going on with emergency departments in Oregon. We're going to move to our next agenda item, which is looking at emergency department utilization and boarding data. And this is one of the children's system key data indicators that I talked about earlier that is helping us understand the system and the impact of the work we're doing.
Okay, and I think I'm screen sharing correctly. So Chelsea, if you wouldn't mind running the chat just in case there are questions. So this is data that we've just finalized. So you're seeing it hot off the press here. And so this covers 3 years of emergency room data, and it focuses on our youth and young adults. So we ran this data set ages 0 through 25. So, and a few of the slides are through 24, so we could get a comparison, but it really is giving us a snapshot of what's happened over the last 3 years. So to orientate you to the information, this is emergency department utilization data. And so what it covers is essentially visits, but they get called discharges in the world of this kind of thing. So if you hear discharges, I'm talking about number of visits. And I'm just rearranging my screen, so hold on a minute so I can see my notes. So it describes patients who went into an emergency room, and what it counts is actually a treat and release, which you see there, which means that somebody went in and then came back out again. So the reason for being really clear about that is if the Portland hospitals that have inpatient units, if somebody sits in an emergency room and is then admitted to the hospital, so they go up to the psych floor, or even if they're in a local hospital and for whatever reason they end up on a medical floor, they end up not counted into this data. So we know that some of this underrepresents some of the Portland population because they're going that way, or maybe something like an eating disorder where the young person ends up admitted to a floor. They will be excluded from this just because they weren't treat and release. So just want to be clear about that up front. We've covered infancy through age 25. And so what it does cover is if a young person was transferred from one hospital up to another to go to inpatient. So that does count. And what we did here was to look at mental health or substance use codes when they were the primary diagnosis. So that means the number one reason that somebody went to an emergency room. Because as you probably appreciate, often you get lots of different codes for various mental health problems or for different things that get done. So we limited it to primary codes. And so that's the background to this data set. And I wanted to just make sure when we talk about emergency room boarding, then it means that a young person has spent over 24 hours in an emergency room. So you'll see that come up later in the slides, but it does reflect those often who have been, who either were very complex in the emergency room or who ended up returning just needing to stay longer because they're waiting for a bed at some other place. So in terms of the data, you'll see me use years. A year for us as defined within this is July the 1st to June the 30th. So they're state financial years. So sorry if that's a little bit confusing, but I think overall it gives us a picture. Often numbers are less than 10. So if it's less than 10, we suppress those numbers. This comes from a data set that's called the Oregon Hospital Discharge Data. And so this comes directly from hospitals, not from our internal data set. So this does cover all Oregonians. And you'll see that race is included in some of this, and it's patient reported. So, and I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with hospital systems, but they are still incredibly binary. And so we have very little data about any transgender or other pieces that we might want in that area, but we also, from a race point of view, that is coming out of their system, not ours. So that's those things around data. The first thing to talk about is who goes to an emergency room from a point of view of insurance. And Medicaid covers the most of the young people who are in emergency rooms. There's a third of them, young people are covered by commercial insurance. And you're seeing a number of young people here who are uninsured. This is primarily those between the ages of 18 and 25 when they no longer have insurance covering them. So this circle represents 8,285 young people who visited an emergency room during the year 2022. So just wanted to make sure that you get a sense of how many young people that really represents. So and almost 9,000 young people, probably if we threw in those that went into the hospitals in Portland, it's probably just under 9,000. So this is the picture for substance use disorder. And you can see that Medicaid is covering a larger percentage of this population. And we have a larger proportion of those young people who are in that situation who are uninsured. So, and these numbers have stayed pretty steady over the 3 years that we've been really looking at in terms of the insurance coverage. So it's always hard to speculate on what the background is to all of these things, and you'll hear as we go through, it's like, well, how do you interpret this data? And so we just have to be really cautious on that. And this may well represent the large reliance on emergency departments for uninsured people, as opposed to anything else. You know, we're kind of trying to figure out the whys, and that's really the next work to really try and look at some of this. So if you look at the discharges by year, you can see that the numbers have been falling since 2020. Numbers using the emergency room have actually fallen overall by 9% over that period. This isn't what we're hearing from the conversations and some of the anecdotal things, but the numbers coming in through all of the systems are showing this decline over the last 3 years. And the percentage of emergency room boarding, that's this darker blue at the top, has been increasing very slightly. It went from 7% to 9.5% in 2021 to 9.4% here. So that means that, you know, almost 10% of young people who go to an emergency room end up potentially staying more than 24 hours if they were there for something to do with mental health. For, I think that was the whole, I'm not used to my slide pack yet. This is for the whole picture, and I'm just breaking it down into mental health. It is a larger proportion of those with there for mental health concerns who end up staying longer than 24 hours. So what we see here is that it was 11% in 2021, then 14, and it's now at 13% of the total number who've been in an emergency room. So this is the picture for substance use. So there are way fewer young people as a percentage that are ending up spending more than 24 hours in that setting. And for ED discharges by how old they are, this one shows you how many 18 to 25-year-olds are in this population who are in emergency rooms, maybe going back more than once, and maybe staying longer than 24 hours. The smallest numbers, we're pleased to report, continue to be the 0 to 9-year-old group, where it's around between 358 here and 289 there. So the thing when we think about some of these young people who are in emergency rooms, they are often very complex. And we've seen some of them have very long stays in emergency rooms as people try and figure out how to help them best and where they can go to find help and support. So this is some data around how long people stay in an emergency room. And so I want to go to the bottom first and talk about the maximum length of stays. So what we did was to look at who stayed the longest. And so the maximum length of stay for one of these 18 to 25-year-olds, they were in an emergency room for 35 days. So I think many of you may have been in an emergency room, and just to know how austere and difficult that situation can be, you're generally not allowed to leave the room. Or if you leave the room, it's only to go to the bathroom. So just really thinking about the impact and the trauma that this can create for young people when they are stuck in this situation. And we had one 9-year-old who was in essentially for 2 weeks in an emergency room somewhere in Oregon. So just really calling the humanity out on this and how we do this. We often find that these young people are in child welfare care and custody. So, or they are waiting for placements in somewhere like our secure adolescent inpatient unit, and there's no space, or all sorts of reasons lead to this. But all these numbers are way higher than we would want to see. We also then looked at the top 100 stays. And so these are here. When we looked at the top 100 individuals, we just did an average for those. And you can see within that the average is around about 8 or 9 days for this group of complex youth. So this represents some of that, that 1,109 that I added up had been in for over 24 hours. So it's showing some of these young people and what's been happening for them. So looking at this data, I want to recognize that the higher population areas, obviously we can see clearly have the higher numbers inevitably of those young people. So we looked at where people's residence was, and you can see that Multnomah, Washington, Lane County and Clackamas are the top 4 for areas with young people going to the emergency room. That's no surprise. So after this, the numbers go into some rates per 10,000, just to help us look more at the picture across Oregon. But you can see that the Portland area has the most young people looking for care. This is the discharge rate, so the number of visits when we use rate per 10,000. And so this shows you that there are a couple of counties where we see more use of emergency rooms than others. Douglas County has been on this list for the last few years around usage of emergency rooms. We're also seeing Curry and Coos here. It's really important when you think about this one to just make sure that you recognize the much smaller population of young people certainly in Curry and Coos than there is in Douglas County. So Douglas County had 423 young people in emergency rooms apparently, and then Curry and Coos, it's more like a handful. So it can really skew these numbers, but it's still interesting and important for us to look at where people come versus the Oregon average, which is down here at 64 per 10,000. So this shows the number of young people who are in emergency room boarding. So the number of people who stayed longer than the 24 hours. And so you can see here that Douglas County is standing out as having way more young people who are in emergency rooms for that kind of period. I think it's important to know that in Wheeler County, again, a very small number of young people are in that county. And so just recognizing that that can increase or skew the way this looks. The next highest here is Multnomah County at 12.5 per 10,000 residents. So I'm just looking at my notes to make sure I don't miss anything. I think that's the important pieces from that slide. And the next slide is this one. So this is some data around race and potential racial disparities in terms of the way emergency rooms get used. I do have to point to the note at the bottom that says that, essentially says that this data really continues to be rocky, because we really know that we recognize that we haven't done a good job of collecting the race data. So it is as identified, and we have a lot of young people who are not either not identified or will not have self-identified the race. But for what it's worth, this picture indicates that we have an overrepresentation of Black or African Americans who are in an emergency room for longer than 24 hours versus all the other populations, apart from this others, which is a sort of amalgam. So really just wanting to say this is of concern, and may well suggest that there is some bias or something that's happening that means that Black youth are being kept for longer than others in an emergency room. So hard to be able to, again, figure out what this means. but it is something that we need to pay attention to and recognize that we need to be focusing on in terms of what do we do next. And, you know, the other option or the other potential piece that we see is that it may be that there's a larger percentage of ED visits by certain groups rather than a higher rate. So that may also swing this. So if you had a lot of uninsured Black youth, for instance, that could skew these numbers. So we're really needing to kind of look at, well, what does this mean? What does this tell us? So the next slide is about, do people come back to an emergency room? And yes, this shows you that 13% of all youth who visit an emergency room come back within 30 days. And that percentage is way higher in our 18 to 25-year-old age range, so 15.8% of those young people. So that's 15 in every 100 have returned to an emergency room. But we are seeing significant rates here, particularly in our infancy to 9-year-olds, where almost 10% have come back. So absolute numbers, just to ground you in this, the 0 to 9% the 0 to 9 age range, 27 young people came back. In the 10 to 13-year-old age range, 60 young people returned. In the 14 to 17-year-old age range, 187 young people needed to come back to an emergency room. And in that final group of 18 to 25-year-olds, 1,227 young people revisited an emergency room more than once. So those are kind of big numbers to wrestle with and to just think about the overall impact of our work. And then just looking at that from a county perspective, you can see that there's a relatively even spread across Oregon. That was different in some other years when we've done this. But you can see there are a couple of outstanding ones. Harney County may well be a function of some of the work that's done out there with OYA and some homes. So they may have ended up, that may be a contributor to a very small youth population, but they do have a number of really, really difficult youth. And in fact, my little note says there was only one readmission for the 23 total admissions. So again, small numbers make big impacts on these kinds of graphs. So in summary, children, the young children under the age of 10 are the smallest number of young people in an emergency room. Our 14 to 17-year-olds were the highest proportion of the top 100 longest boarding times. The young adults, our 18 to 25-year-olds had the most ED discharges and were the most likely to be readmitted within 30 days. And Medicaid is the largest insurer of ED visits for young people. And over the last 3 years, so we have to try and figure out what COVID means within this, ED discharges have decreased, but the proportion of those increasing, experiencing boarding saw a small increase. The number of substance use discharges has declined, but boarding has shown a small increase. And total ED discharges reflect our largest population centers, and county rates for both the 24-hour boarding or 30-day readmission really vary considerably across Oregon, and racial disparities appear to be an indicator of ED boarding. So that's the presentation, and so over to all of you if you have questions or comments on this.
Hello, this is Caroline. I feel like, thank you so much for the presentation. Very, very enlightening. I have two comments that may not be related to each other. And one is regarding the data for the increase, or maybe the higher number of African-American, Black and African-American children using the emergency services for boarding or being readmitted or, visiting the emergency more often. I have a feeling that it has a relation to maybe the level of homelessness or the idea that they don't have stable places to stay at home. And so they find it safer to be at the emergency department. And therefore, there is need for looking into maybe the issue of housing as a way to stabilize some of this. This is just general, obviously it needs more research to look into whether this is an actual indication, but I feel like if they are using the emergency services more often and getting readmitted and boarding there for lengthy periods of time, it could have an indication to instability back at home and not necessarily the diagnosis. And I've been wondering, because not all cultures recognize the diagnosis that for mental health the way they are. Like, for example, if I'm struggling with homesick, if I'm homesick, I don't have to be diagnosed with an adjustment disorder. I'm simply experiencing an adjustment that is probably temporary. And the question is, why do we have to attach any mental struggle or any mental stress to a diagnosis that relates to an illness versus we need to just stabilize this. We need, some of these things need coaching versus mental health therapy, or versus someone going to the emergency and being given medication. I feel there's broader discussions around mental health and behavioral health among our youth and among, people of color, because not everyone understands the mainstream approach of diagnosing everything that presents in the emergency in the form of a mental stress or mental instability. And I appreciate the presentation.
Thank you. I think we hear what you're saying. We just don't know enough. At the moment, we're looking at numbers and really starting to open up this conversation to look at this data in all sorts of ways. And I appreciate in the chat Jenny's comments about disability, because yeah, at the moment we can't access that data, and I will actually ask the hospital data system about whether they do have that data. I'm not sure. So, but it's a work in progress. So we felt we wanted something rather than nothing, but recognize the imperfection. And we've got the birthday boy on screen, so hi, Chester, happy birthday. Everybody give him a wave. Another year older. Okay, Carol.
Thanks, Hillary. This is fascinating. And a question and a comment. The question is, was COVID factored into the decrease? And I think the reason that's important is because in the next 3 years, if we see an increase, it may not have as much to do with the systems, but rather with the fact that COVID is gone and people are accessing emergency departments more readily. And then secondly, it would be really interesting. I think when we hear the word discharge, that assumes an appropriate stay, that the youth or child was ready for discharge. It would be really interesting to follow up, and here's where the qualitative aspect comes into play, to follow up with families to find out if they were discharged into a state of relative wellness, into the, if they had access to the services they needed, or if they were discharged into crisis. Because that makes all of this much more meaningful.
Thank you. I think, again, we appreciate that. And I'll speak for Brian, and I don't know whether Beth's here, but MRSS, Mobile Response and Stabilization Services, are our big hope for dealing with some of that and connecting folks to ongoing stabilization services as they step out of an emergency room and connecting into that world. So, you know, I think we're really looking forward to seeing that, the growth of that work and the difference we can make in communities and to families and youth with that service. Jenny.
Yeah, actually, Carol kind of covered part of what I was going to say. And then I just wanted to point, I appreciate you pointing out what I said in the comments, but also I just wanted to share that in a lot of meetings I'm in, a lot of advisory councils, I see disability being left out of the conversation. And so just bringing that up in this space, that there's a lot of kids with intellectual and developmental disabilities going into the ER in crisis. And I just hope that in the future that it will be tracked.
Thank you, Jenny. And we would appreciate that many of these complex youth are youth in the developmental disabilities system that we're finding really hard to place and to get services connected to. Connie.
I want to say thank you for this presentation. And when I see the statistics about youths from 18 to 25, they start sometimes, they stay in the hospital over the 30 days. And I was thinking why, because so sad that we don't have here in Oregon some places they need some treatments, but we don't have places for those treatments. And I was thinking on my experience with my daughter, we stay over the 90 days in the hospital because Oregon don't have a place to send her to receive a treatment. And she never received a treatment because we don't have here in Oregon. So I was thinking, like, how many kids and families separate because youths need to stay in the hospital because we don't have places they receive a treatment for them. We don't have beds for them. So thank you.
Thank you. I don't know whether you want to comment on that one, Chelsea.
Yeah, just that again, it's oftentimes when we look at this data, there's more questions like you all are bringing up of the why and the analysis. And we are presenting to the Hospital Association next week, I believe. So part of it is doing an analysis with hospitals so that they can talk to some of the whys and what happens. Again, it ends up being somewhat qualitative, but you're absolutely right, Connie. And that's why this is such an important children's system indicator, because while it doesn't tell us all the things, it should reflect the continuum. So the broader and more responsive the continuum is that we build, we should see less reliant on and less boarding in the emergency department, right? It's not an apples to apples all the time because of all the things you all have brought up. But it should start going down as a front door to the children's system.
Did you have a question for us? Probably
yes.
struggling.
Yeah, Kirk Wolf, child psychiatrist, OCAP. First of all, I want to thank you for the presentation of real data. And several thoughts come to mind, actually, in some respects, repeating what some have said, but also a real important point. This data is data during the pandemic through June of 2022. And certainly during part of this, families were afraid of getting COVID if they went to the hospital. And so that definitely impacted whether they wanted to go or not. I think also, are families satisfied with, why they go to the emergency room? And I share with families, if you go to the emergency room, this is your reality. A minimum of 4 to 6 hours waiting there. If you go to OHSU and you're under 16, you have to have an adult with you at all times. And so overnight stays, that also includes a parent needing to stay with their child. And that just is not doable if you've got other children, for example. And the parents that I work with are really stressed. These are stressful times. There's a youth that I'm working with that has an intellectual disability. And really, I've come to the conclusion that if you're working with a youth with an intellectual disability, you are not going to be admitted to a psychiatric facility, no matter how severe your depression or anxiety is. This particular youth, we've got 15 to 20 members that attend team meetings. Most recently went to an emergency room that I highly regard. I actually recommended for the people communicate with the ER of major concerns with safety. And unfortunately, this youth was discharged. I can say after discharge, this youth went back to a different emergency room on 2 occasions within 5 days. And I think it speaks of the challenges within our system in terms of being able to get a child the appropriate services they need. And it probably leads to my last point. And one of the functions of CSAC that I just want to make sure we're all keeping in mind is that we're to make recommendations to OHA. And I think we would start getting better outcomes if we started paying attention to youth and family satisfaction when they're in the emergency room. So actually giving them a survey that they fill out at the time of discharge. Did they get the what they were looking for? If we started doing that and started presenting the data and sharing with hospitals, I think that would lead to some meaningful change within our system. So that is a formal recommendation that I would like us to make. And it just comes with experience. I've been doing this for 30 years, and I see things getting worse. So I think we need to pay even more attention to youth and family satisfaction when they go to the emergency room in terms of their experience.
That's timely, since we'll be with the Hospital Association next week, because we can pass on that recommendation as well to them, who would probably need to implement it. So I love that. It's another example of that centering of youth and family voice, right? Surveys are surveys, but it is a way to have informed policy and program by bringing that voice forward.
And probably at the same time, just one last point, also provider satisfaction. When we send the youth to the emergency room, do we feel like the appropriate outcome was there? So both youth and family satisfaction as well as provider satisfaction, both play equal parts.
So yeah, and I would love to see a system where the emergency room isn't the front door to the next level of care, so that you don't have to go there and live there for 2 weeks to get your child into that you can keep them almost safe, but certainly that you're able to manage at home, but they still need that level of care. Because again, why are we forcing people into that situation when we can't do that? Swiftly move them through as a front door. So I see we've got a hand up. Noni, I hope I'm saying your name right. What was your question?
Thank you. Yes, you are saying it right. Thank you. I'm Noni Mathoni Iman, equity clinician here at OHA. And while we are on the topic of the interface between patients and clinicians, I just want to make a quick comment regarding a concern that was raised about assigning diagnosis of mental illness to sometimes what seems a really benign reaction. When clinicians are doing their jobs well and making these diagnoses, they follow a criteria. For instance, a good example was the adjustment disorder that was brought up. A clinician will take history and which includes the length of time this situation has been. Is it out of proportion compared to a normal reaction that one would have if there are some changes in their lives? Or is it impacting, and also is it impacting functioning for that person? So the diagnoses are not supposed to be thrown willy-nilly. A lot of thought goes into them. But that said, we are all aware that African American or Black children do get misdiagnosed disproportionately with schizophrenia, without sometimes taking proper history or understanding because of the clinician bias. So that's also something that we are aware of as clinicians and need to be aware of. And also as parents, it's good to question a diagnosis that you get from your clinician. But really, when things are working well, it is not just a diagnosis that's assigned because, and sometimes it seems like it is because of the rush, because of the way we practice medicine these days. But really, when it's working well, there is a criteria that's supposed to be followed. Thank you. And thank you for this wonderful presentation.
I would add on to what you said, that it also is really driven by the medical model and money. So, you know, I mean, I think you articulated it well, but there's a lot driving the insurance industry too, that even in some of the electronic medical records, if you don't put in a diagnosis, you can't do the rest of the flow. And so oftentimes there's sort of that system pressure to find sort of the reason why. And I don't know what it looks like in emergency department. I haven't worked in one, but I imagine that is part of their cycle too. And potentially less thoughtful.
Yeah.
Well, thank you.
May I say something? Is that okay?
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's why we have to probably reimagine mental wellness and the best approaches to mental health care in our state, because I don't think it's a one size fits all. Considering that there is also this aspect of you know, what you just mentioned about, you know, how the electronic medical record has forced functions where you have to put in something, a diagnosis for a clinician to be able to proceed with the note, progress notes. But at the same time, there has to be a reimagining or reengineering the way we approach mental wellness in our state. Can there be other ways to ensure that our, you know, the citizens of Oregon are mentally well without necessarily having to go, you know, the route of the emergency services? Can there be community navigators, for example, that can help with this, can be funded to provide some of the care in the community? Can there be other ways that people can get this level of care without necessarily having to go to the ED? I mean, those are ways that we can reimagine and help people feel like they can get the care when they need it without necessarily being labeled a certain way. Because once that label is on you, it remains for a long time.
Yeah, I 100% agree. 100%.
Yeah. Cara.
Yeah, thank you for this presentation. I'm a child psychiatrist as well, and I just wanted to say, kind of circling back to a statement that was made earlier, that would suggest there's a change in culture that we also need to work on, which is this idea that if we keep a child out of the ER and wrap them with intensive services to keep them safe in the community, we have an underlying statement that we're making that this child doesn't really need that higher level of care. And so, yeah, it's something we have to address with programs, that we're willing to do this, and we see that it's appropriate to do that, to reduce the trauma to these children and their families. But we also still are making that higher level of recommendation, and that we are trained, and, you know, the people I work with are qualified to make that recommendation, and it still needs to be understood.
Thank you. I think we appreciate that. What's interesting, Cara, is the data from places that have implemented MRSS fully, so that mobile response and stabilization services, where they found if they can get those services in early enough, they've substantially decreased the need for inpatient care. And we're just not at that stage of being able to to offer enough services to be able to see whether Oregon is the same as those other areas, but we would really like to give it a good go and see whether we can get the need for that next level down to a much fewer number than we're currently seeing heading in that direction.
Just to add to that, similarly, I mean, the IIBHT program that we have implemented in our 4 rural and frontier counties it's magical. And if we could just expand that program, if we could have more skills trainers, more family partners, I mean, the work they do is just incredible.
Well, thank you. We love validation for what we're talking up everywhere. So we truly appreciate that. Grace.
Yeah, hi. First, this is a great, thank you for the presentation. And I'm actually really appreciative of the discussion and many of your comments, Noni. I think that, you know, having worked in emergency department settings as a psychologist and even in, you know, outpatient settings, to be frank, I often felt as though for issues that you raised about reimbursement, Chelsea, that there was a tremendous amount of pressure to make diagnoses. And I think that one of my biggest frustrations, and I think it really lends itself to this discussion, is that I often felt like the child was the lightning rod for systemic issues. And so we're labeling youth and saying, you know, this child is anxious, but ignoring the context. I'm not saying the practitioners are ignoring the context, but I think systemically we're often ignoring the context that are the precipitants of the behaviors that end up leading to a referral or an ER visit. And I've been historically frustrated because I don't feel like we have any way within the current model to address those systemic level factors. And I'm wondering, you know, thinking preventatively, you know, when we're talking about skills building or education, can we widen the net to think about working with, you know, parents or schools or other contexts in which we're finding that youth are having difficulties rather than specifically pointing to the youth as being the problem? Because I do think, you know, to your point, Kara and Noni, that we're creating identity narratives that last a lifetime. And I don't think it's fair that we're creating these identity narratives when it's really the system that is failing the child. And I'm not saying there aren't great people out there doing great work. I'm just saying, I think that often it's the systemic factors that a child or a youth are responding to, and not something unique within the child itself, particularly if there, you know, is a history of trauma that is a precipitant to, you know, a reaction. So I would love to see us as a state move toward thinking about systemic level, even systemic level prevention and intervention efforts rather than putting all the focus on the youth. My radical 2 cents.
Yeah,
I love
Chelsea,
it.
were you going to comment?
Well, I was looking at Jenny's face around ableism, right? Like if we start seeing at it as the system needing to show up versus diagnosing and finding fault with the human, it allows us to do the work anyway. So yes, I would just think of all the conversations we've been having. And again, how do you start inching toward that from a policy and program perspective, knowing that diagnoses can be incredibly helpful around awareness and acknowledging something's going on and getting the support you need. So it's like, how do you balance those from that program and policy perspective as stuff we need to keep talking about so we can inch forward?
I agree, Chelsea, and at the very least, give practitioners enough time to thoroughly assess rather than, you know, particularly in emergency departments, you don't have the luxury of time. And I think that that's part of the issue right there in terms of, you know, the conditions that are created for people to diagnose. The time just isn't sufficient. Maybe we can address that on a policy level.
Thank you. Roxanne.
Sorry about that. I was wondering if there is any data from a lived experience point of view dealing with the emergency department or even in primary care, all of those things. I have noticed that I have noticed a blocking of, or a reluctance of individuals to get the care and mental health care they need, myself included. Because once there is a mental health diagnosis on a medical chart, it feels like the perspective seems to be, from my point of view and many others' point of views that I have advocated for on their behalf, that once that's on there, it's like a lot of things get blamed on that instead of ruling out physical ailments. And so you have to constantly battle the stigma within your own medical team to get medical answers for physiological thing. And everybody's talking about, oh, this is mild, it's fine. I mean, even recently, my doctor, I got an X-ray. It showed degenerative changes in the cervical spine. It showed a spondylolisthesis, a slip disc, basically, and it's causing significant pain that's radiating into my shoulder, one of my shoulders, and it's reducing my mobility, right? And so the first thing and she reads this, the doctor reads this and says, oh, it's just mild arthritis, mostly due to your fibromyalgia and probably, anxiety related. Okay, so a slip disc is anxiety related. Okay. I mean, I get that anxiety can exacerbate the pain that you might feel. It can tense up your body and make things worse. And there's definitely a high correlation between mental and physical health, the gut brain axis, all of that. I even teach that stuff. But from a consumer's perspective, it feels like we are always fighting that stigma to just get the same like if that wasn't on my record, then those things would have been valid and validated and pursued as, maybe there's a way that we can reverse some of these physiological processes and improve your quality of life. But if it's on there, then your quality of life sucks because you have mental health stuff, and that's just the way it is, and there's nothing else. It's really difficult. So I was wondering, if there were, that's a long-winded way to say this because it's hard to put it into words sometimes, but is there a way to, is there already an initiative, or is there a way to create an initiative to raise awareness in the medical field, especially with the, physical medical field, or maybe even some data that can be gathered from individuals to see how big of an issue is that in blocking people from getting to their goals, their wellness goals, and actually improving their quality of life, which would also inadvertently improve their mental health conditions. So I was just wondering if that's anywhere in the data schemes, or could we potentially include it if not?
I mean, my initial response is I have no idea. You went way out of my scope of my brain and expertise. So I think we can take what you said and go back and ask some questions of our Medicaid partners and our health policy and analytics to see how do we crosswalk that into any data that may exist. But I think my unexciting answer is I have no idea.
Yeah, we have to suspect that bias and everything else plays into it. My daughter experiences panic attacks, and every time,
Yes.
or maybe heart issues, and every time we have to go through this thing, and yet we know the statistics say that because of her trauma and background that she will probably die 30 years younger than the rest of us, but it still feels like it's minimized when we go in for anything physical. So I appreciate your comments there, Roxanne. Kurt, you had a question or a comment?
Yeah, Roxanne, totally agree with what you're saying. And a couple of things. I think this is the case throughout mental health care. I think one of my roles as a child psychiatrist is not only look at what's happening from a mental health perspective, but possible physical health that may be contributing or directly causing. And so that consultation piece is sometimes the most important thing that I can do. And then secondly, it speaks of the importance of primary care. In every child that I work with, I am making the recommendation related to primary care. I think on CSAC, we used to have primary care involved. They have not been attending at least this meeting. And I think we need to get back to primary care representation on CSAC. Thank you.
Thank you. Noni.
Thanks, me again. I just want to really couldn't agree more with Dr. Bullock, and thank you so much, Carol, for bringing up some of these points that you brought up about this diagnosis. I just want to also add more weight to what was said earlier about providing resources to community, and I think it's what Carol was alluding to about a change in paradigm. So as a clinician, when you have someone that that comes with a mental health condition, and you start you're taking care of that person, and also knowing that you're going to discharge that person to a community that has enough resources to support this person so they don't end up getting worse. I think, and we did see the huge success when we applied the health systems partnered with community-based organizations during the pandemic. And so learning from that and moving forward, giving these communities resources to do this work. And then lastly, I also want to see us as communities, especially communities of color, that we also need to realize there is a stigma to mental health that we are talking about. We also have to be honest and know that sometimes mental health can happen. It's a real thing, and the way we, there's a fear, there's a stigma that until in a way that even people who need care are afraid to seek care because of that fear. So if we can start talking and addressing that, as well as the other issues that we are talking about, where diagnoses are just thrown about, especially in people of color, that become a life sentence for them. So clinicians learning to be, learning about their racial bias, and also the community learning that yes, mental health can happen too. Thank you.
Thank you, Noni. And I want to recognize, I think you're a physician's assistant over in public health. And so really appreciate you bringing that public health lens and also your expertise in that general medicine area.
Thank you.
And somebody else has their hand risen, and I don't know what your name is. I can see you're the Risen Community Organization.
Yeah, my name is Liban Satu. I do concur with Noni and the others what they mentioned. We know there's the myth in our communities. There are traditional beliefs, there's the religious belief, and there's the scientific that the whole world is using to do diagnosis and to arrive to vaccines or medications. These are three components that we cannot afford to ignore. The reason why I say we cannot afford to ignore is because, as everyone has mentioned, there's the denial part of it. And if somebody believes in the traditional way or believes in the religious way, and you try to incorporate together with the scientific, I think this would really work. For example, when you take somebody's vital signs, and you show him when it reads this way, it reflects something that is taking place in your body. For example, if somebody has a blood pressure and all this. So, and this person would see the reality with his own eyes and try to imagine the feeling that he has when we have a physician who can, or together with an interpreter who can incorporate, they can work hand in hand and be able to explain to this person, yes, we agree, you are a religious person. You can go through prayers, but the reality is there's a problem, there's a disease, you are suffering from something. And here is where the scientific part comes in. I think with this kind of approach, we would be able to head somewhere. Somebody in the family would realize and will be able to support you to convince this young man or whoever is suffering to kind of get the support they need. So this is something that I think we need to look into it, how to incorporate all this and be able to have our community convinced. You are all aware what we went through during the COVID. But at the end of the day, after all that denial and we lost a lot of lives, they came to realize it helped. It saved lives. Right as we speak, we still have people who get COVID, but they don't die because of science. They already gotten their vaccines, did not stop anybody from getting the COVID, but it does not harm like the way it was before. We are not losing lives. So this is a reality that science works. But at the same time, because of psychological issues and mental issues and traditional beliefs, we need to incorporate all this. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those comments.
So I heard, and I think Kirk put in the chat earlier of, again, practicing the role of CSAC, again, if there are, obviously we're taking minutes and notes and we can go back to what people have shared today, but if there are any formal recommendations, I heard one from Kirk around us communicating or starting a conversation with hospitals about qualitative data and surveys, potentially after people leave emergency rooms, which I will be transparent about. I do not have the power to make that happen, but I have the power to ask the question and bring it up and advocate. But are there other, from a CSAC perspective, and Kirk, if you want to ask it in a different way, are there other recommendations, again, other than the work that we are doing around building community-based services and psychiatric residential treatment capacity? There's some other things that we're working on. And maybe, Hillary, we add a slide at the end of some overarching topics of things that OHA is doing around emergency utilization and boarding. That might be helpful for this presentation as we move forward. Yeah, are there other recommendations for us to take back to OHA that came up for all of you, other than what's been said, that we can pull out to review with you in the next meeting? And I see Carol's comment about the great discussion, and I absolutely agree.
If not, we'll come back in a year's time with the next thrilling installment, which hopefully involves fewer children in 24-hour boarding and continuing low numbers.
Well, and I think ideally too, in our next iteration of the plan, one of my fantasies around it is to have targets, for all of us, not just OHA or our unit again, but targets of where we would like to see those numbers over time, given the investments and the work that we're doing in local and statewide communities to support that. And again, ideally not having the emergency department be the front door, as Kara said, like from a policy perspective, like we tell people to go to the emergency department to get medical clearance and get a recommendation for these higher levels of care, and that doesn't always have to take place. So, well, if you think of other recommendations, feel free to throw them in the chat. Again, our goal is to, get better at hearing, documenting, coming back, the loop back, that hashtag, to make sure what we heard and then be able to follow up back with this group on both recommendations, but also the great conversations that you all are having. We want to make sure that we continue to communicate those to other parts of OHA or other child serving systems so that that can inform policy and program that we may not oversee in our unit.
As I've listened to, everything that has been shared, I think we all agree that it seems like we're on the same page. We love the discussion. We love the evolution of this conversation. And I couldn't help but think about the idea of reinforcing approaches like the Afrocentric approaches to mental health and wellness, which is maybe a hybrid of the mainstream approaches to mental wellness and the cultural dynamics that build the wellness of people, or build the way people build culture and the way people do life in the community, like bringing up a hybrid way of doing things and being able to reinforce that so that people can thrive in the environments that they are used to, and they can find ways to heal in those environments from a place that is more familiar, so to speak. Because as it has been said here, a lot of, for example, Africans and African immigrants and refugees don't, in their mind, the idea of going to a therapist or going to a hospital because they're in a mental health crisis is not an idea that is going to be an immediate default. But yet they struggle. But again, it's been mentioned about stigma. So when they struggle, they find other ways in the community, right? And so some of them may buffer into addiction and drugs and getting into gang violence and stuff like that, just because they're looking for ways to let out or express how they are feeling. But it's because it's not a default for someone to think about, pick up the phone, call the doctor, and schedule a 1-hour therapy session, because life is done in the community, in the social settings for these populations. So if we can find ways to reinforce things like Afrocentric approaches to mental wellness or Afrocentric approaches to care, it might help diversify options for these people. And then we can come up with ways to measure outcomes, just like Noni mentioned about how the vaccine, COVID vaccine outreaches were best effective when we worked with community organizations at grassroots levels. We saw a lot of Black people getting vaccinated because they were receiving this information from the same communities that serve them, so that we were able to eliminate any mysteries that come with vaccinations in general, because there was a trust that was built by the fact that they were receiving this information from people that they know in the community. So that is one thing I just wanted to suggest as a possible recommendation.
Chelsea, just wanted to follow up. Maybe the thing to do is for only your team to look at this discussion and kind of in a very specific recommendations that come out of it. Let us review it. I just want to make sure we're highlighting recommendations that come out of this data. Really, really important discussion that we've had.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and feel free to add more in the chat as you have them. I mean, some of them are things we're actively already trying to do, and maybe we need all of your wisdom on maybe we're not doing it well enough, or to the last comment, maybe local folks need to hear recommendations from you all to do some of these as well. So, but absolutely, yeah, we'll compile and get back out to the group so there can be, again, that loop back to this group of the feedback we've heard. Well, again, keep going in the chat. The last thing on our agenda was to give an update on legislative session. It's not over. It's not over till it's over. So there may be things that are happening literally right now at this particular moment. But we wanted to share, and I'm just trying to bring up my slides so I can look at it and I can share it. As I mentioned earlier, we had come to this group as we developed that policy option, as we did our policy vision paper in 2020 that we talked about. And oh, sorry, my share screen like suddenly disappeared. All right, let me find it. Not giving me options. So we had put forward several policy option packages in the OHA budget. That budget then goes to the governor. The governor puts together their budget, and then that budget goes to the legislature. So that's how it works. Like we put together asks within OHA, that goes through a process. If it's accepted internally, then that goes to the recommended budget to the governor. They put together their budget, and then that goes to the legislature. And then the legislature is currently making decisions about all the budgets.
Chelsea, if you think you're screen sharing, I'm certainly seeing a black screen. Oh, there we go.
Oh, did it do it? Yeah, my computer, of course, is freaking out. It likes to freak out, especially when I'm presenting. So what I can tell you about our OHA budget at this point, the only things of our ask, and I'll do a quick reminder, we were asking for money to expand our young adult hub programs that we have had in place since 2014. That was a demonstration project. It came from recommendations from young adults through the 21 session. It didn't get funded then. We put it back out there for funding in 2023. It's not going to get funded at this point in time. And then our other ask was around BRS, so behavior rehabilitative services is a service array that currently is not open to all OHP, Oregon Health Plan members. It's a Medicaid service, but the way we've designed it is that it's accessed through child welfare, juvenile justice, and Oregon Youth Authority. And our policy option package was asking for two things. One was to give us state funds to expand access to all Medicaid recipients that meet that level of care and need that service, and also to have money to expand programs, including development of a program for children who have been at risk of or impacted by child sex trafficking and commercial exploitation of children who identify as male. Right now, we have some programs in Oregon for children that have experienced those things, but it's for children who have identified as female. At this point in time, that is not getting funded. There's extraordinary advocacy within OHA to fix this. At least the gap part may not get building funds, but we do have commitment from our Medicaid leaders to figure out a way to do that fix. So, but currently in the legislation, we do not have funding for that or positions to implement that. And then the last, well, there's a couple more. So the other ask that we had was to expand fellowships for child psychiatrists and developmental pediatricians. Currently, families can wait up to 2 years to even get in front of a developmental pediatrician to get an evaluation and get an important diagnosis to understand what's going on with their child. And one of the recommendations we have heard, I think ever since I've been in my position, so at least 6 years, was to expand the fellowships to get more professionals in the field for child psychiatry and developmental pediatricians. That currently is getting funded. So I'm crossing my fingers that it continues to move forward. And so we would be partnering with OHSU to expand fellowship opportunities over the next few biennium to expand that access. So we're excited that that's happening. we did have an ask for suicide prevention. I think Annette talked about that at the beginning. It was for finishing up the funding for the Youth Suicide Intervention Prevention Plan and expanding funds to start funding the Adult Intervention and Prevention Plan. And that did not, at this point in time, move forward, which is heartbreaking. And then the other ask that we had that didn't make it into the governor's budget, which was to add mental health respite to our state plan, which would require all CCOs and Open Card to fund and reimburse for mental health respite. Currently, that happens in pockets of the state because some CCOs have chosen to fund and reimburse for that. But we have heard a primary recommendation from families and youth and young adults that that is a needed service that needs consistency across the state, and that did not move forward, which will be an ask in 2025. So all of these asks that didn't move forward, we will continue to advocate because we have heard consistently those asks through our work. But we will work with all of you to update those recommendations and asks as we move forward. And obviously, if there are additional asks and things we want to prioritize over the next couple of years. These are some bills that have passed through legislation that impact children and children's behavioral health. The first one is Senate Bill 968, and that was a bill put forward by the System of Care Advisory Council, and it moves their strategic plan from 2 to 4 years of when they need to report and update it. And it it allows youth that have been appointed to that council to stay. Even if they turn 25, they don't get kicked off, they can finish their term. And then I believe it also gives a position to do target and elevate and amplify youth engagement for that council, which is exciting. House Bill 2421 is addresses guidelines for applied behavioral analysis interventions. And so that did pass. And then House Bill 2757 expands and provides funding for the crisis system. And so when we've talked today about mobile response and stabilization services and that initial crisis response, this provides funding to continue to enhance and expand that system that we're trying to build. So again, this is a huge cornerstone of system of care, that we would get to youth and families when they call and get what they need when they need it, and be able to stabilize them, hopefully outside of or instead of an emergency department, but also impacting all of our other child serving systems so that they're getting escalated pathways into getting their needs met. And to the comment earlier, it is not designed to be just a behavioral health or a mental health intervention. The goal of this model is to look at food insecurity, look at housing insecurity, look at your religious community, and if you're connected or disconnected, to look at parks and recreation and resources in the community. So really trying to show up and walk with youth and families in a really different way, and not just the purpose being a diagnosis. And I could go on, but many of you have heard our presentations on mobile response and stabilization. The thing I will note is that there's incredible resistance, probably because of COVID funding fatigue at the county level, to stand this up in the way that it's imagined and designed. And so we really do need people paying attention at the local level to support the local leaders to implement this in the way that youth and families have really asked for directly, and that we want to see across the state. House Bill 2767 expands recovery high schools across Oregon in a I believe not all at once. So they're not building 9 recovery high schools in the next 2 years, right, Kathleen? Like it goes
3 at a time.
3 at a time. Thank you. So this is an exciting, innovative way that Oregon has stepped into, at least since I've been in my position, to really look at having safe and supportive places for children in recovery to go to high school in a different setting. And so this is a pretty big investment. It'll be really exciting to see over time the outcomes and ways that this can intervene in the youth system. So those are ones that we're aware of. Are there any others, Kathleen, that have come up since we've put the slide deck together that you want to speak to, or is that kind of where we are at this point?
I think this is where we are. I'm not aware of any others, but
Okay.
everybody should understand there's still a lot going on in the legislature as they wrap things up. So a lot's going to happen today and possibly tomorrow.
Yeah. And I guess what I would say is I feel like I've gotten spoiled with all of you and in my position in the other previous sessions, except for the young adult hubs. I think we've gotten funded for almost everything we've asked for in the last sessions I've been a part of. And so I've been a little outraged. I'm like, wait a minute, like we're thoughtful of these asks. Again, we've done it alongside community. We've tried to prioritize and only bite off what we can actually implement and do. And so I understand there's a lot of competing factors at the legislature and it's hard decisions that they're all making. But it does speak to us really working hard to walk together and advocating within our state to make sure that we can build out that continuum that we'd all like to see. Kirk and then Jenny.
Chelsea, related to what you've just been talking about legislatively, as well as the ER data presentation, I know there were bills to expand higher levels of care. And I think when we look at the boarding issue and family satisfaction, it's just so important to fund higher levels of care. We are just so short here in Oregon that it's dangerous, quite honestly. So I would hope
that
would be funded legislatively, as well as one of the recommendations from our discussion on the ER data presentation.
Well, and I hope to have more data for this group soon around, we do the capacity data in our newsletter every month. So you can look at sort of where we are with beds and the recovery from COVID of the existing beds that we have. And we do have 2 new programs that are funded. But I will also say, Kirk, we don't have a good handle on the data of how many children are being referred or need that higher level of care. And that's what we're working on now, to at least look at the wait list and deduplicate it so we can bring back to this group and say, this is how many kids are waiting and this is who's waiting. Because we don't have a window into that at all, except from more of a narrative data. So that's to come hopefully soon, so that we need to right size the system. I worry that we keep saying we need to build beds when we don't know how many kids are waiting, and we have to recover the current providers we have. So it's a yes and for me, for sure. I worry about continuing to build more and more beds when the philosophy is really what we've heard today, which is keeping kids and families in their homes and their communities. So it's both.
But the reality is we're not building more and more beds. We are not building more and more beds. And in fact, with the staffing shortages, et cetera, we've had to cut back on residential beds as one example. So we're not building more and more beds.
Well, I'll follow up with you. I mean, we can bring to this group what the work we're funding now to build more capacity. The other piece about that is if money does come, often it is not allocated to children's behavioral health. And so my hope is that in any budget bill that comes to us that is saying it's about building residential, that my hope is that it's allocated also, or a percentage is allocated to children's behavioral health, because in the large package in 2021, we only got 7 million, whereas the adult system got 130 million. So again, we need to, if there is money coming in, it has to be marked and allocated for children's behavioral health, also, although otherwise it doesn't come. Jenny?
Yeah, I was just reading over the House Bill 240 or 2421 summary, and it does say allow applied behavior analysis professionals to provide outpatient treatment for mental or emotional disorders or chemical dependencies to certain patients without parental consent. And a lot of the kids who end up in ABA therapy are intellectually and developmentally disabled. And so I'm just wondering, I saw there was a comment kind of explaining, but I just want to share that again, that concerns me because a lot of kids maybe need support making consent. And there's a big controversy about ABA therapy giving kids PTSD.
Yep. Yeah, and we're getting ready to publish the feedback we received in that the community conversations we had in the fall and winter. And I think the ABA conversation that we thought was going to happen during this legislative session did not happen. So hopefully that continues to we continue to have that conversation. Was there another ABA bill, Kathleen, that we were following too, or is this the only one?
There was another one, and I don't have that number at the tip of my fingers.
can
But I
share
don't
it.
think, I don't think it made it through.
Oh, it didn't make it through.
I don't think so.
Yeah. Question in the chat, ABA conversation. We did a series of 6, I believe, just open conversation with some guided questions around sort of tell us what we need to hear about applied behavioral analysis and I always say applied behavior analysis as a treatment. And so we heard from people with lived experience, parents, providers, about it, and we were just mostly just listening because at this point there are guidelines and oversight as it relates to Medicaid payment of ABA, but there isn't program or facility oversight at the Oregon Health Authority, and so we're starting to gather information. And that was another thing we had asked for in our POP, which I don't know if it'll come with that 1 million, but 1 million, I don't know if we got position authority, but we were hoping also to get a position on our unit that was looking into IDD mental health, which would include ABA, but I don't think we got position authority, but I can update this group. Yeah. And so we'll have something about that in our July newsletter with a link to the report of just sharing what we heard. Again, loop back. It's hashtag loop back. All right, so lots of work to do, my friends, and hopefully you're all emailing Tamara going, I want to revision CSAC because I'm ready to change the system with OHA and walk with. We have a lot to do. I will open it up to, even though we aren't really following our bylaws, I still want to be mindful that we used to do public comment. Which again, we're not saying only members can speak, but this could be our last 15 minutes of anything anyone wants to bring up, ideas of future things you would like to hear about as we have a work group of sort of revisioning, knowing that we have plenty to tell you and plenty to talk about, especially as we update the roadmap this year. Well, you all are troopers, 2.5 hours. That revisioning group could make it a shorter meeting. Thank you everyone for showing up and sharing your own experiences, your experiences as providers and giving feedback. And Kirk, as always, of appreciating the data, but also wanting action, which we are all for. So please take a look at the roadmap of what we're already up to, what we plan to initiate in the second half of 2023 and the first half of 2024. And we'll keep talking.